Hello and welcome to another episode of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and life coach in private practice in London. This video follows on from my last video titled A Critique of Queering. Now, I want to tell a story about what life could be like if queering realized all its world-changing ambitions. The genre of literature called queer dystopia arose in the latter part of the 20th century to explore oppressive totalitarian systems that demand complete obedience and crush individual expression. This is a rich and important genre that provokes reflections on the real potential for oppressive systems of social control. I want to flip this on its head and imagine a world where everyone goes about living in a queer way in opposition to all forms of social control. What would queer dystopia look like? Before telling this tale, it'll be helpful to provide a basic orientation. As you may know, queer no longer applies just to homosexuality and gender fluidity. It now means being at odds with any and all social norms. For the premise of my fictional story, I'll assume the definition of queer is offered by David Halperin in his 1995 book Saint Foucault, which is widely accepted in the queer movement. Halperin says, and I quote, "Queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or in any stable reality. It is an identity without an essence. Queer, then, demarcates not a positivity, but a positionality vis-a-vis the normative, a personality that is not restricted to lesbians and gay men, but is in fact available to anyone who is or feels marginalized because of his or her sexual practices. By definition, queer is whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant." I want you to focus on the last sentence, as I think it captures the essence of the queer positionality. Queer is opposed to whatever is considered normal, legitimate, and dominant. This includes the organization of time and space, knowledge, social roles, hierarchies of expertise and authority, language, boundaries, law, economics, religion, and political systems. Queer theory and queering have sought to deconstruct every one of these areas and more. Basically, it is at odds with and subverts anything that puts constraints on individual freedom in service to social cohesion and collaboration. Any such constraints are automatically seen as oppressive. Queer theory proposes no system of norms to replace this, as that would simply be another oppressive system. So, what would our world be like if everything was queered? Rather than describe such a world abstractly, it will be more interesting and impactful if we imaginatively explore a day in the life of someone who lives in it. This was difficult to write because when I explored its logical implications, that world disturbed me. I tell this story for the purpose of pointing out the harm of queering everything, especially the psychological and social harm that can be caused to children by exposing them to sexual acts. My intention is educational. It is not for entertainment. You can take this as a trigger warning and buckle up. I call this story Lucille in Queer City. Yesterday, Zur went by the name of Jack. Today, Zur has decided to be Lucille and currently lives in a flat with Zur's 7-year-old trans son named James, formerly Amelia. Their flat is provided by the city, and they're required to move to a different flat every 6 months as a measure to disrupt normative routines. On this particular morning, as usual, the wake-up siren goes off at a random time, and Lucille opens Zur's eyes. The siren sounds randomly as a measure the city has taken to queer time. There are also no clocks, watches, or timekeeping devices. These are relics of the old world. Just one of the many things that are now understood to be anti-queer, like getting up at the same time every morning. Lucille sleeps in what used to be called a hallway on a pile of laundry. Zur gets up, stumbles sleepily toward the front room where Zur hears some commotion. Along with clocks, doors to residences are a thing of the past, as they are boundaries that keep people out, and exclusion is a bad thing. Lucille notices that 3 of her neighbors are on the floor in the front room engaged in a BDSM session that involves a riding crop, a ball gag, and handcuffs. James is sitting on the sofa eating breakfast of dried fish and watermelon and watching the neighbors go at it on the floor. There is the sound of flesh being smacked and squeals of pain, pleasure. Lucille feels a deep stirring of unease, but replaces this with a pleasant sense of pride that Zur has been faithful to the queer creed of not imposing any oppressive norms on James. Zur sleeps naked, and so has not yet gotten dressed and sits naked on the sofa beside James. They watch the neighbors together, and Lucille becomes aroused. James notices this and winces, closes his eyes, drops his fish and watermelon on the sofa, and walks away. He has learned at the Unschooling Center that being queer isn't always easy, but sometimes it seems too hard to him. All right, time out from the story for a moment. I hope that you're as appalled and revolted by this as I am telling it. When we start doing away with norms and boundaries, particularly with children, we run the risk of putting them in harm's way. I want to be absolutely clear with you and with YouTube that is my purpose for this fictional account. I mean to cause a sense of revulsion and a resolve to not allow children to be so exposed. I have attempted to describe something horrible with as few graphic details as possible. Now back to the story. Lucille is not hungry this morning, so Zur puts on an orange blouse, a purple adult-sized diaper, and some black steel-toed boots. This is Zur's version of queer fashion. It is time to take James to the Unschooling Center for the day and then head to work. Sometimes Gloria, James' birthing person, shows up to take him, but unpredictably. So Lucille decides to walk James halfway to the Unschooling Center herself. Parents are discouraged from fostering dependency in children. The reason is that this creates norms of responsibility and prescriptive oppressive roles, which is frowned upon by queer doctrine. But Lucille can't resist the instinct to walk James at least halfway. Lucille has a car, but rarely drives. It has become too dangerous since licenses are no longer required and there are no traffic laws or common agreements on how or where to drive. You can drive however and wherever you want. The more unpredictable, the better. There are frequent accidents. Walking isn't much safer, as there are no laws or police, and anything can happen out there. Lucille and James set off toward the Unschooling Center, and it is a relatively uneventful walk. Only once did they have to get off of the sidewalk to avoid an oncoming car. When it is time to part, Lucille gives James a pat on the head and says, "Be careful and have a nice day." James just nods, gulps, and heads off on his own. Zur tries to have faith that other adults will watch out for James as he walks the last 7 blocks to unschooling alone. The Unschooling Center is where children from ages 2 to 17 come to learn about queer theory and queering. Children of all ages gather in a large space and are taught about the history of oppression before the revolution and the dawning of the queer age. They are also taught that it requires ongoing vigilance and effort to not slip back into the tyranny of normativity of any kind. They are taught that we all have the dark tendency to want to impose norms on others. Children are encouraged to explore a great range of possibilities for performing different identities and expressing themselves free of any oppressive norms. Suggestions are made for younger children and costumes provided to help them play with different possibilities. There are princess dresses, soldier uniforms, fairy wings, antlers, tails, and so forth. The older children with more experience are more creative and come up with their own unique ideas. There are endless suggestions for variations for sexuality and gender. Some adopt furry identities and practice being different animals. This is not mere child's play. It is preparation for performing these identities as adults in the world and being affirmed and recognized as such. Whatever a child chooses, adults are present to affirm their identity and provide guidance on how to fully embody that identity. For gendered identities, this can include hormone blockers, hormones, and surgery when needed. Children also experiment with queering art and music. There are no aesthetic standards, no 12-tone scales or rules of harmony. Whatever children create, it is praised as long as it doesn't mimic anything considered normal. Additionally, children learn how to queer language, history, math, and science. Whatever might have been considered true or valuable in the past is set aside and avoided. Everyone is free to think up their own way of understanding and doing things. Fundamentally, the Unschooling Center is a place to awaken critical queer consciousness and learn how to perpetuate the queer revolution by becoming adept at queering every aspect of oneself and the world. There are unschooling centers for adults, too, with mandatory attendance for those who have fallen out of queer consciousness and attempted to establish anything normal, legitimate, or dominant. It turns out that education for children and adults is difficult due to the queering of language. The meaning of words often change as people are encouraged to come up with their own definitions. Of course, this doesn't just make education difficult, it makes communication difficult. One is never certain about understanding others or being understood by them. Such is considered the cost of freedom. After walking James halfway to the Unschooling Center, Lucille waits at a bus stop for a bus to take Zur to a deconstruction site, where Zur is a deconstruction worker. If enough people show up, the job is to destroy old walls and fences in the city that were built to separate spaces for different uses, such as playgrounds, graveyards, flower gardens, public parks, pedestrian malls, and private residences. These old boundaries must be deconstructed for the queer revolution to live on. It was hard for Lucille to know how long Zur waited at the bus stop, but finally one came. After a harrowing ride and several near accidents, Lucille arrived at the workers' meeting place at the deconstruction site. After what was at least an hour by old-time standards, 23 workers finally arrived. Since hierarchies of authority and expertise were no longer a strategy for groups to get things done, Lucille just grabbed a sledgehammer and a chainsaw and wandered off with a couple other workers looking for walls and fences to destroy. Zur needed to build up credits for accessing food and essential items, including public transportation allowance. These would be added to Zur account when the facial recognition CCTV cameras that were installed everywhere provided proof of Zur labor and relayed that information to a computerized system that would then automatically increase Zur credit. It didn't always work, but it was the only way to earn some kind of income. After a day of smashing stone walls and buzzing through a few hundred fence posts, Lucille decided Zur had worked long enough to build up some credit. There was no such thing as a standard work day. You just worked as long as you felt like or needed. The sun was nearing the horizon when Zur headed to the Unschooling Center to pick up James. When Zur got there, Zur was told James had already left. There was no such thing as a standard unschool day either. Children were allowed to leave any time after the random leaving school siren sounded. So Lucille walked home, hoping that James would be there. When Zur arrived, Zur called out for James. "James, are you here? Are you here, my child?" No answer. Looking for him room to room and not finding him, she heard a pitiful sound coming from the closet in James' room. She opened the closet door, and there he was, curled up in a ball, crying. There was blood everywhere. James had opened a big gash in his forearm with a kitchen knife. "Oh, James, what have you done?" cried Lucille. "What's the matter?" Lucille scooped him up in her arms and brought him to the bathroom to examine and wash his wound and bandage it. Throughout attending his wound, Zur kept asking, "What's wrong? Why have you done this? Did something happen? Talk to me, my little boy." But James was silent except for his crying. Finally, through his tears and whimpers, James managed to say, "I'm so confused. I don't want to live anymore." Lucille didn't know what to say. Zur thought to herself, how can my child be so unhappy while living in an age so free from oppression? Feeling at a loss, Zur asked, "Do you want me to call your birthing person to come and be with you?" "Yes, I do," James managed to whisper. So Lucille called Gloria and explained what had happened. James could hear her concerned voice through the phone, but couldn't make out what she was saying. The call was brief, as Gloria was desperate to come see for herself what was going on and comfort her child. As she lived nearby, this took only a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, Lucille brought James to the front room and sat with him on the sofa, waiting for Gloria to arrive. Zur put her arm around him and tried to comfort him, still not knowing what to say. In the awkward silence between them, Zur thought this might have something to do with neurodiversity, but couldn't understand how that could cause such behavior. When Gloria arrived, she sat on the other side of James and plied him with the same kind of questions that Lucille had been asking. "Tell us what's got you so troubled, sweetheart," she asked. James could only say a version of what he had already said to Lucille. "I don't know what's wrong, Gloria. I'm too confused. I don't know how to talk about it. Life is no good, and I don't know why, but I don't want to be here anymore." Gloria quit asking questions and just held James in her arms and let him cry. The three of them sat together in silence for a while, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the three neighbors who had been there in the morning came striding happily through the open doorway with a pot of hot food. The one who had worn a ball gag earlier announced that they had come to share their dinner, which was a stew made from the meat of one of their dogs that had died the previous week. Lucille got up and waved them away with the back of Zur's hand. "Thanks for the offer, but this isn't a good time for us," Zur said rather stiffly. The three uninvited guests looked offended and disappointed, but in keeping with the one queer rule of consent, they apologized for the intrusion and left. Lucille, Gloria, and James all agreed they weren't hungry. In any case, all there was to eat was more dried fish and a bowl of dates, so they decided to go to bed early. And then they did something they had never done before. They all laid down together on James' bed in his room and just held each other. James, who had stopped crying earlier while being held by Gloria, felt a sense of comfort and safety, and they all fell asleep together. When the random morning siren sounded, Lucille opened her eyes and looked over at Gloria and James, who were also just waking up. He felt a deep sense of both love and sadness. "I don't know why," he thought, "but today my name is John, and my pronouns are he, his, and him. And just maybe I'll stick with that." The end. This may sound like an exaggerated and unlikely story, but that's the nature of dystopian fiction. It is a warning call about what can happen when bad ideas are allowed to fully run their course. I believe that queer theory and the activity of queering the world carries the potential for everything in this made-up story. It portends a special kind of danger for children who need protection and a predictable, i.e. normal and meaningful way to become part of a secure social fabric. If you think that such a queer world is undesirable, do not go gently into that good night, but rage against the dying of the light. If you've gotten something out of this video, please give it a like and subscribe. And don't forget to click the bell for notifications. Also, share it with a friend and leave me a comment. I want to know what you think. That's all for now. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. And be willing to stand up for and save what needs saving, build what needs building, revise what needs revising, and leave something of value for future generations. Bye for now.